Morning, folks. Welcome to another daily devotional. We're going to be continuing to focus our thoughts on this picture, this analogy that Paul has given us in chapter 3 and verses 13 and following of the Christian race, or the Christian life being like a race. We were thinking yesterday of Paul saying, "This one thing I do," and the whole idea being concentration of purpose on what is wanting to be obtained or attained. And what Paul wanted, of course, was to be more and more like Christ. Well, he goes on and he says this, forgetting the things that are behind. And the idea that he has in mind there is again to do with running. A person who is running a race does not look back every 20 or 30 metres to see how far they've come or to see who's behind them. To do that would be, at the very least, to slow them down, but it could also cause them to stumble and fall. I used to go to the gym quite regularly, and I remember being in the gym once and watching football while I was on a running machine. The problem was that the television was slightly behind me, the way the gym running machine was set up. And as I was running, I could hear that a goal had been scored, and I turned my head and looked slightly behind me to see who had scored and to see the goal. Of course, what happened? Having looked behind me, I lost my concentration, I stumbled, and I shot completely off the running machine and fell on my back. You don't look behind whenever you're running. Paul says, forgetting the things that are behind, I press on towards the goal. What sort of things did Paul think he shouldn't look back on? What are the things that are behind that he wanted to forget? Well, most probably his past sins. He wasn't able to completely forget his sins. And you remember how one of his greatest sins was pursuing and seeking to put to death Christians. He couldn't wipe that away from his memory. And we know even from his writings that from time to time they came back into his memory. And at least 3 of his letters, he mentions the fact that he persecuted the Church of Christ. But the point that Paul is making is this: he didn't look back on them in the sense of so dwelling on them and allowing them to be a weight around his neck that they slowed him down and held him back from making progress in his Christian life. In that sense, he forgot about them. He put them behind him. Those sins, yes, he committed them, but they were forgiven. They were covered by the blood of Christ. But as well as that, there was something else that Paul meant when he said, I forget the things that are behind. Not just his sins, but also his former achievements. There's no doubt that as an evangelist, as a missionary, as a church planter, Paul had achieved wonderful things. Yes, it was God working through Paul, but Paul was the human instrument that God used to plant churches all over the Roman Empire. And Paul could so easily have succumbed to the danger of looking back with pride and patting himself in the back as a result of what he had achieved thus far. Looking back in such a spirit of self-satisfaction and complacency would have hindered Paul. If you're running a long race, looking back to see how much distance you've already covered is stupid. You'll end up stumbling and falling. So Paul forgets the things that are behind, his past sins, his past achievements. And instead of looking back, he says he is straining towards what is ahead. I press on towards the goal. And the analogy again is of a race. It's a picture of a runner coming towards the finishing straight and looking for the line and stretching towards it and straining every muscle and leaning forward as he strives with all his might to reach the finish. So Paul, instead of looking back, had his eyes firmly fixed on what lay ahead, and with that in view, he put everything he had into getting to the end of the race. And surely that's what we ought to be doing as Christians, having our eyes fixed upon the goal of making progress in our spiritual lives so that we move increasingly closer towards the goal of being like Jesus. And if we're to do so, not only is it something that we are to give priority to in our lives, this one thing I do, but we must also refuse to allow our past sins to hold us back. We must refuse to allow our past achievements to cause us to stumble. We must focus our attention on what lies ahead and press on towards it. We're coming towards the end of 2022. As I broadcast this, we're almost into December of 2022. Well, in the year that lies ahead, let us focus our thoughts on what lies ahead. Let us concentrate on seeking to make progress towards that goal of being more and more like Jesus. And don't look back. Don't allow past sins to hold you back. Don't allow past achievements to cause you to stumble. Instead, press on towards the mark of the prize of the upward call of God in Jesus Christ. May God bless you today. Hope you have a wonderful time. Every blessing.